Hello and welcome everyone to Ontologies of the Fold, led by Levi Bryant, and here he is.
All right, so thank you for joining me in Ontologies of the Fold. Just a few ground rules before we get started. I would strongly prefer for you to keep your cameras on while we're in session, because it gets a little bit disconcerting to see blank faces when we're discussing things. And hopefully we can have a lot of good discussion in this class. That makes it much more satisfying and fulfilling, I think. In addition to that, let's please try to refrain from using the sidebar unless it's absolutely necessary. It seems to work much better when we actually speak and pose questions. And so over the course of the next 8 weeks, we're going to be looking at a variety of different works, trying to flesh out this concept of the fold as Deleuze develops it. And so we'll be starting today with Leibniz's discourse on metaphysics, as well as the monadology. And from there, next week, we will be moving on to the first, I think it's 2 or 3 chapters of Muriel Combs's book on Simondon, which is really quite good. Rumor has it that there is supposed to be a translation that's going to come out someday on his 2-volume work on individuation, but we have no idea when that's going to come out. But that's this book right here, and there is a link for that I'll give you right now. And this will give us a broad overview of his concept of individuation and the trans-individual. And then after these first 2 weeks, we'll be moving on to Deleuze's Foucault. And so that's this book here. I'm not sure if there's an online version of this or not, but we'll be spending 3 weeks on the Foucault book, which is where, to my knowledge anyway, Deleuze first begins to develop the concept of the fold. And then finally, we'll be rounding out the semester with the infamous the fold, Leibniz, and the Baroque, and exploring the concept as he develops it there in that magnificent and rather challenging work. I wanted to ask, is there anybody here who has a strong background in French? Do you have any good French speakers? Because from what I understand, and I sense it in my reading of these 2 works, and unfortunately my French isn't the greatest in the world, there are a lot of problems with these 2 translations of Deleuze's book. In particular, it seems that the translators were unaware of the mathematical language that Deleuze is pulling on deeply from calculus and other branches of mathematics, and so it gets translated in some idiosyncratic ways. And so we're going to have to be attentive to that as we read the text, and to try and suss out some of these problems that come up as we're reading it. And so the way this will work, each week somebody will come up with a set of questions over the material that we've read for that week. And hopefully we can go ahead and figure that out now. It looks like 1 or 2 of you is going to have to come up with questions twice, since we only have 6 students that will be regularly attending class. Artem has agreed to do the questions over Leibniz. Artem, how did you find the Leibniz?
Well, it's my second time actually kind of approaching him, and the first time I did was before I read my Nietzsche and before I read my Deleuze on Nietzsche, and this was a bit eye-opening, because now most of my questions are how does Leibniz end up being so similar to Nietzsche? So
that's really interesting, and so perhaps you can educate us on those sorts of connections that you're seeing there. Do we have a volunteer for next week on the Simondon and the Muriel Combs?
I can volunteer.
Okay, Jacob, you'll be doing that. Would somebody like to, or to start us off with the Foucault the following week?
I'll do that.
You'll do that, Meredith. Would it be possible for you to turn on your camera, or?
I'm overseas and I don't want to throttle my data too much. Let me turn it.
That totally makes sense. So you will be the disembodied
But
voice.
only today. Only today. Next, I'll be back in the U.S. shortly. Or
Where are you?
within data. I'm just in China for a few days this week.
Oh, wow. Exciting. Okay, so what I'm trying to do in this seminar, I'm working on a new framework of things and objects based on this concept of the fold. And I'm still in the process very much of developing this, this concept, but I want to see all things that exist as sort of pleats of matter. And so there are a variety of different concepts of the fold that are developed in recent philosophy. We find Heidegger's fourfold, which I won't be dealing with at all, I think, in my own work. There's the concept of the fold as developed in Merleau-Ponty as well, and it might be interesting for a future seminar to do something with Merleau-Ponty. I'm not deeply familiar with his work, so that would be certainly a learning experience for me. And of course, there's the concept of the fold that Deleuze develops in his very, very late work. And one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is to what degree is the concept of the fold, as I'm developing it, convergent with Deleuze's, to what degree does it depart? And so the basic idea that I have, to put it in very vulgar terms, is that everything is a pleating of the world around it. We can think of, for example, to choose a sort of privileged example, the suntan as a kind of origami. And so what is it that happens when our skin interacts with the sunlight? It folds that sunlight into itself and it produces a property or a quality of the object in response to that environment. And I'm trying to conceive of all things in these sorts of terms. And I'm interested to see whether or not something in Deleuze's concept of the fold is convergent with this way of thinking about things, or if there's a substantial difference here. And so that's basically where it is that I'm coming from. And we can talk about that more as the issue arises over the course of the semester. But perhaps for today, we can jump straight into the Leibniz and see where that takes us. And you know, I noticed in my reading of these two particular texts, and Deleuze's work engagement would be much broader with a wider variety of texts, we don't really encounter anything like this term, the fold, in Leibniz's own writing. And so this is something that is extraordinary that Deleuze is up to in his own work. He has a way of reading philosophical texts that, that in a certain sense transforms them and extracts a concept from them that might be there, that might not be there, but that provides us with incredibly novel readings of these things. And so, Artem, you want to launch us for the day, or did we have any remarks before we jump into that? The Leibniz?
Well, I guess, first of all, I have to apologize. I don't have a very huge background in Deleuze, so I wasn't sure that I was asking the right questions. But the starting thing that was kind of not bothering me, but that was kind of perpetrating the entire reasoning, especially in monadology, was I thought maybe you could clarify the relation of reason into the world. So it seems like he draws a lot, for example, the conclusion of God's existence as the primordial monad seems to kind of be fixed with the idea that there is supposed to be a principle of sufficient reason, yet it's kind of resting itself on the point that everything is there is a kind of continuity of rationality between the world and the subject, and it doesn't seem that he goes into the naive sayings of there is like an absolute epistemology, but it does seem that I'm just not sure about how much power does Leibniz entrust into reason.
What do we think? And so we have the monadology, that's the later work of his mature philosophy. But as we were reading these two very, very short and abbreviated texts that are incredibly challenging, I think. I mean, you know, I don't know, what did you all think about these texts. I think they require a great deal of reconstructive work to make sense of where it is that he's coming from. The Discourse on Metaphysics is the earlier work of his, and there's continuity between these two texts, but there are also some differences that we might uncover as we try to read them carefully. And so your question here that you want to start us off with, Artem, is to what degree does he have a certain, could I rephrase it as a certain sort of faith in the power of reason, or?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry.
Oh, Tal did show up. Right, and so, I mean, I guess one of the questions might be, why is it that he believes that substances and nature and existence has to have a rational structure?
Is it based on that everything in the world is contingent on having a reason for its existence? Like the fact that you can ask, why is this here? There must be a reason for its existence.
Yeah, but why would we be committed to that claim, do you think, Maria?
It seems to rely on, that's what I wonder, like it relies heavily on there being like a subject position, somebody that asks. That's actually one of the things I'm wondering, like why there needs to be like somebody who asks the question, asks for the reason, and that has to be within like a subject position. That doesn't really answer your question, but it's part of it.
He's deeply committed to this thesis, and I think, you know, my take would be that his reason for this commitment all issues from the nature of God. And so we have two types of theology, right? On the one hand, we have revealed theology, which could be said to be what is taught in sacred texts and books, all of these different stories we read about Job and Abraham and Moses and Jesus and everything like that. And it's called revealed because these are things that we could never know on our own. They could only be revealed or disclosed to us. Our imagination wouldn't lead us to a knowledge of these sorts of things. And then on the other hand, we have rational theology, what could be known of the divine through reason and the power of reason. And this is very much a matter of definitions and conceptual determinations. The conception of God that we find in these two different types of theology can be quite divergent from one another. They can be at tension with one another. And so if we were reading something like Plato's first dialogue, the Euthyphro, right, we see something like this tension between revealed and rational theology, where certain claims about the divine disbar or undermine our ability to claim certain things as being true in Greek mythology. And so for Leibniz, how is it that he approaches the concept of God? What is the definition of God, just like in geometry, that he's working with? What's the essential determination of God? I think we find it right at the outset of the Discourse on Metaphysics. Does anybody remember what he says there in section 1?
I just want to give an aside before I answer it, but I think it's sort of revealing. I read the monadology first, not realizing that the discourse was written earlier. But reading the discourse second is quite revealing, because in the monadology, his definition of God comes quite a bit later into the text, whereas in the Discourse on Metaphysics, he opens with God, which I think is revealing, because it seemed in discourse as we started with God and then moved on from there, whereas in the later text, it's almost like he's hiding that presupposition of his that he's starting with God, and I just thought that was interesting. With your comment, Levi, but what I have in my notes is, and this might be a direct quote, but God is the absolute perfect being. God is the being that provides sufficient understanding for all other substances. And that seems to be the underlying thing behind Leibniz's entire system.
Yeah, and this is the setup, right, for the great debate among the rationalists that Kant later on will pick up on, because here you have these rationalists. They are using each one of them, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. They claim to be applying a certain mathematical method to thinking about the nature of the universe as a totality, the nature of the soul, and the nature of the divine. And they say we can reason just in the way we do in geometry about these things and come to absolutely necessary truths as a consequence of this sort of reasoning. But each one of them comes to radically different conclusions about the nature of the divine. And this seems to be because they are beginning in different places. And so, it might be somewhat unfair to Descartes. In the case of Descartes, Descartes is treating the essential determination of the divine or God as being an omnipotent, all-powerful being, and this is why he will support this kind of voluntarism of truth and reason. God has God's power to change 2 plus 2 into 5 rather than 4. In the case of Spinoza, what's the emphasis placed upon? The absolute infinity of God. He doesn't think that we can have a clear concept of perfection. And then finally, in Leibniz, we have the contemporary of Spinoza. We have the determination of the divine as a perfect being, and this thesis that, by definition, and it's an a priori claim. It's not something taken from a sacred text or anything like that. By definition, the divine is a perfect being is like Barq's root beer, right? What is it that makes Barq's root beer the best root beer? It has bite. And this is going to have consequences, because if God is a perfect being, then this perfection has to be reflected in everything that the divine does in some way or another. And so how do we get to the question that Artem here was originally asking, of the high place that Leibniz gives to reason in the universe? Well, if God is a perfect being, then it also logically follows that God has to be a rational being and do things in a rational way, because it's more perfect to be rational than it is to be irrational or to do things arbitrarily. And so this is going to be a big point in Leibniz's overall argument and why he's led. And I don't know about you guys. I mean, as I read the Discourse on Metaphysics, as I read the Monadology, on the one hand, I am filled with wonder and awe at the claims that he's making. On the other hand, I think they're just batshit crazy insane. These are very strange, surprising claims that he's making. And so we have to ask ourselves, what would it mean for the universe to be rational? And there are going to be 3 principles that are at the heart that the universe has to meet in order for the universe to have a rational structure. The one is going to be, I think, Artem, you mentioned it, it's going to be the principle of sufficient reason, right? So we're going to have, and tell me, hopefully you can read this, and I apologize for my handwriting. So we have the principle of sufficient reason, which is going to claim that for everything that exists, one formulation of it, and we can give a variety of different formulations, which work.
Oh, just the to the Simondon text.
Oh, I put it up here. It should be right here.
It doesn't work.
Oh, it says it's not found. Okay. Let me look it up real quick. I just brought it up earlier.
It's all right if you include it in the classroom later. If you wanna.
It's coming up right now. Let's try this again. Otherwise, you can just do a search for That link work?
Yep.
Oh, and just before I get into these different principles, generally in my seminars we take a break around 7:30 or quarter till 8 or quarter. What is it? 6:30 or quarter to 7 for about 10 or 15 minutes just to get a drink and so on and so forth. All right, so what is it that the principle of sufficient reason states in one form or another? It states that for everything that exists, there is a reason that it is thus and so and not otherwise. And one thing, there are quite a few variants of this throughout the history of philosophy. One of the things that's interesting about Leibniz's formulation of it is that he is referring not merely to efficient, what Aristotle called efficient causes, the pushes from behind that led something to become what it is in the way that it is, but he's also talking about teleological causes or final causes, purposiveness. And to give a complete explanation of something, both of these questions have to be answered. Come from what led that thing to be produced? Why does the tree outside my window here have exactly that shape and no other shape? And how does this somehow contribute to the overall purposiveness of the universe in which we live? If you were looking at somebody like Lucretius, the Roman atomist, it would be very different. He wouldn't see any purposiveness to the universe. Things aren't for anything. They only come from other things and other causal sequences. And so we have the principle of sufficient reason. We have at the foundation of logic and reason, we have the second principle, identity. Just the idea that A equals A somewhere or other. Leibniz will say that nothing is a being unless it is a being, unless it is identical to itself, and it fulfills this criteria of identity. And I think this is where a lot of mischief is coming from in Leibniz's conception of substance, because when we throw a third principle of reason into the picture, we get the principle of non-contradiction. And so here, I'll just abbreviate it. In logical form, we can write it with the negation sign, parenthesis, A, that dot in the middle signifies and not A. Something cannot both be and not be. And so when we put these three principles together, if we begin from the premise that God by definition is a perfect being and therefore God must be rational, then it follows that God also has to create a rational universe. That he has to create a universe in which the things that exist meet these three constraints. But problems immediately emerge. The moment we start talking about things or objects or entities or substances or monads, whatever we want to call them, problems emerge the moment that we try to put all of these three principles together. And why is that? Right? We want to say that Artem here, insofar as he exists, he is a being. He is Artem is equal to Artem. But what do we notice? Right? We notice that with the passage of time, something really bad happens to Artem. He becomes not Artem. How does he become not Artem? Or at least it seems like this at these, at a glance. And this is why Plato rejected the world of appearances. It seems as if Artem becomes different than he was before. Right? Maybe his hair gets longer. Maybe, heaven forbid, Artem, you lose your hair or something like that. Any number of changes that you undergo as you're listening to the seminar, right? You now have thoughts in your mind that you didn't have in your mind before, and that seems to violate the principle of contradiction. You're not the same as you were before. How are we to account right, for this change that takes place in the physical objects that we see in the world around us. Likewise, with the principle of sufficient reason, when we look at what it is to give an account of something, or to explain something, to provide a reason for something, what do we notice about that? We notice that we have to refer to something else, right? And so why is it that the tree branches have the shape outside my window that they have? It's not merely because of the genetic structure of the tree. It has to do with the other trees that grew in its environment and the way it competed with them for sunlight. It has to do with the substances that were in the soil that it drew from. It had to do with the wind patterns here in the state of Texas that blew in a certain way that the tree had to navigate. All of these sorts of things. The tree is referring to things outside of itself, and this seems to violate the identity of the tree. It is, again, to bring us into a contradiction. And so the sort of question I think that Leibniz is asking, and maybe I'm getting it wrong, is how can we account, how can we have a universe that is rational and that obeys these three principles, yet nonetheless does justice to the fact that things change and become in all sorts of ways? And so he has this profound commitment to reason. Why does he have this profound commitment to reason? Because God is a perfect being, has to do things in a rational way, which is going to have consequences for how we think about the nature of substances or things that exist in the universe. And this is going to lead him to make very, very strange claims about the nature of the universe that we live in. And I don't want to, necessarily let the cat out of the bag immediately as to what those strange claims are going to be. I'm sure you have picked up on these. But I think one of the things that we also need to remember about Leibniz is he belonged to this sort of golden age of philosophy where philosophers didn't exist yet as a professional identity. He was primarily a diplomat as well as a historian. And if you read up on Leibniz's bibliography, he was involved in all sorts of colorful adventures and some very strange diplomatic ideas to advance the interests of the people that he was working for and his patrons. But we see, I think, throughout Leibniz's writing, this sort of diplomatic way of thinking about the world, of trying to balance all of these different perspectives against one another and find the kernel of truth in them and form a coherent philosophy out of all of these positions that seem like they would be contradictory. One of the things that we have to keep in mind as we look at Leibniz's philosophy is that he draws a sharp distinction between two levels of reality. And so on the one hand, there's the phenomenal level of reality, the way things appear to us. It seems as if I'm interacting with this computer right now, that this computer is modifying and changing me in all sorts of ways, that I'm changing it and acting upon it. And then we have the metaphysical level of the way things really are that is quite different. And in the Discourse on Metaphysics, he gives quite a nice example of this. He talks about Copernicus. Right? The true reality that Copernicus shows us is that the Earth orbits about the sun, but he says still we say that the Earth, or that the sun rises and sets as if the sun is orbiting around us. That's the way it is at the phenomenal level. There is a series of well-founded illusions about the nature of reality, but they don't get at the metaphysical truth of things. And so do we get this point about the three principles of rationality? And they're going to have profound and massive consequences. So any comments or remarks here?
So just to clarify, the sufficient reason is then contained within the identity, right? Because that would explain like so the contingency of things and also their necessity.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting to the metaphysical level a little bit here, but if we just think about it, what is the sufficient reason for Maria? right? All the way down to, you know, the freckle on your nose or something like that. Each and everything, each and every aspect of you, there has to be a reason for it. It has to be accounted for in some way or another. And when we begin to think in terms of sufficient reason, we see it violates your identity in a lot of ways. If you are a being, then you have to be identical to yourself. A equals A. But as we begin to account for my existence or your existence or the existence of that tree outside my window or the rock, right, what do we notice? We are perpetually talking about other things that account for our existence. And so, you know, what is going to be the sufficient reason for you or for me? It's going to be our parents, how we came into existence. But then what else do we have to account for? We have to account for why did the Barry White come on at that particular time, you know, making them feel amorous towards each other. How did they meet? How did their parents meet? What sort of world historical processes took place to bring these people together in the first place? We're going to end up talking about the movement of tectonic plates, the very formation of the planet Earth and the sun, the beginning of the universe. To account for everything, what do we notice? You have to trace everything back through the entire chain of causes. And of course, none of us are ever going to be able to give the sufficient reason of anything that exists because we just don't have access to this entire chain of causes going back to the beginning of the universe. But if we are, and I think this might be what you were getting at a little bit, if we are to avoid a sort of infinite regress, and these guys all think an infinite regress is a bad thing, if we're to avoid an infinite regress, there must be some sort of first or prime cause that is necessary rather than contingent that presides over all of this chain of relationships. And we'll also notice, if we go with the more common sense view, when we ask, well, you know, what is the reason for that tree existing? We're not satisfied simply when we get cause and effect answers that, you know, the bird ate some berries and then went to the bathroom and the seed fell right there and the wind blew it just to this particular place and then it rained and then the tree grew. Right? We also want, reason also craves a purpose for that tree. Why did that tree have to be there? And this is a huge difference between Spinoza and Leibniz on this particular point. Not only are things the result of causes, as Spinoza would argue, but they must also, for reason to be satisfied, they must also serve some sort of purpose in the universe. There's a reason that I exist rather than not exist. There's a reason that my life took the path that it took, and these things happen to me rather than not happening to me. Leibniz thinks that reason demands this. Whereas in the case of Spinoza, who places his emphasis on the infinity of God, right, the battle cry of Spinoza is simply that if God can create it, God does create it. God doesn't limit itself in any way. There's no purpose to things. And so there is a version of Hitler out there that was a great benefactor of the Jews in Spinoza's universe. There's another one, a female version of Hitler. There's a version where Hitler got into the art academy and went on to become an artist and he didn't get all upset and everything. If it can exist, it does exist. And there's no purpose. God is just this kind of unfolding of every possibility. Whereas in Leibniz's universe, right, there's only one universe that exists. The other possibilities don't actualize themselves. And then we have to give an account, well, why does God create this universe rather than all of the other possible universes that God could have created? And of course, what's the famous answer to that question?
Well, this is the most perfect of all the universes.
Yeah, this is the most perfect of all universes. And Jacob, what would be the argument that God has to create the most perfect of all universes?
It'd be something along the lines of, well, God is perfect, so God is incapable of anything less than perfection, so God must choose the most perfect of all possibilities.
Yeah, and so, I mean, there's a universe in which that was possible, in which Jacob wasn't Jacob, he was Jacob or something like that, and somehow that universe would be less perfect than the universe in which Jacob is named Jacob, or somehow the fact that you have brown hair makes this a more perfect universe than other universes that that could exist. And certainly I think we could all agree that a universe without Jacob wouldn't be nearly as good as a universe in which Jacob does exist. But God by necessity, right? We see why they're called rationalists. This is something that we can never verify through an observation or any sort of empirical methodology. This has to be a matter of deductive a priori argumentation that reason demands. If by definition God is a perfect being, then God has to create the best universe that can exist. Why? Because God can't be a slacker. He can't do anything less than the best. And, you know, it's an interesting thing. If we were going from the standpoint of observational experience, when we look at the universe around us, I don't know how you guys think about this, but I mean, do you think we would come to the conclusion that this is the best of all possible universes? I mean, this universe is horrible. It's a terrible place to live at the level of phenomenal experience, at the level of observational experience. We have all these people getting sick in Puerto Rico right now because they have no water or electricity for their, you know, MRIs and dialysis machines and everything like that. We have the great cruelty towards people and just all sorts of terrible things. It's only reason that could lead us to that conclusion. And if we concede that thesis deductively from rationality for any event that takes place, what do we have to say to ourselves? We have to say to ourselves that somehow that thing existing contributes to this being the best of all possible universes. And that could be in the effects that it ultimately you know, produces down the line in some way or another. I mean, I find it very difficult to get my head.
Yeah, it seems as if he assumes that the last instance is determined in the first instance. So whenever the beginning happens, the end is already determined, right? Each substance contains within it all, like, the entire history of the universe. And so the end of time is always determined in the beginning of time. And so each action is already determined within this system going towards this ideal end. I think there are a couple of criticisms that may be made. I don't know how to make them best, but couldn't we say, like, that I feel like an argument along the lines of the ends don't justify the means could undermine this perfection. Or I've been thinking, like, what would Leibniz' answer be to the question of, well, is having a universe where there is all this pain better than no possible world at all, or a world in which there is all this pain better than a world in which, or than no world at all? And you might say that that's an impossibility for God, but I'm not sure how.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's Voltaire's response to Leibniz, right? And so you get the short novella, which you can find online, Candide. And Candide is a follower of Leibniz's philosophy, and he was raised by a Leibnizian, and he goes on all these adventures, and he sees horror after horror after horror, just the severe brutality of the world in which we live in, you know, and you know, women being burnt at the stake for witchcraft, the Black Plague, all of it being sold into slavery, death everywhere, disease. And, you know, the sort of joke throughout the novella is each time he sees one of these things, he says, but this is the best of all possible worlds. Somehow this contributes to this being the best of all possible worlds. And then finally we get to the end of the novella, and the horrors of things have stacked up so much that Candide finally throws his hands up in the air and he exclaims, boy, if this is the best of all possible universes, what are the others like? which I think is something similar to what you're saying, right, Jacob, that can we really justify this sort of suffering that we see in the universe in the name of this big plan? It almost seems like a kind of utilitarian reasoning from a divine point of view to suggest this sort of claim. Now, I didn't find it this time, so maybe it was a different translation that I was using in the past. But how is it that he tries to address this sort of criticism? I seem to remember in the Discourse in Metaphysics that there was a passage where he talks about looking at a painting. And maybe I just missed it when I was rereading this material for the seminar. He says, look, think of the universe as being like a painting. And if you're too close to that painting, if you only look at one small portion of it, it looks like it's a horrible, ugly mess. It's a mixture of browns and greens and yellows and all of this sort of stuff. It just looks disorderly. It looks ugly. It looks like a mess. But if you get just the right perspective, if you stand back just enough, all of this stuff that looks like imperfections coalesces together to produce the beautiful painting. Now we go from Monet's, lily pads looking incredibly ugly when you're too close to looking very soft and beautiful. He says, well, it's exactly like that with the universe that we live in as well. The reason it looks so horrific, chaotic, and disorderly is because we're just too close to it. If we had the perspective of the divine, if we could see things under the aspect of eternity, then we would see how all of this forms a beautiful tapestry where everything is interrelated in the best possible way, giving rise to, there are going to be two sides to what makes this the best of all possible universes for Leibniz. On the one hand, he says, it is the universe that has the simplest laws. And so there's that wonderful passage in the Discourse where he talks about somebody appearing to randomly draw dots on a piece of paper. And if we were to look at this, we would think that those dots on that piece of paper are a chaotic mess, but there's an equation, he says, a simple equation that could describe the order in which those dots were put down on the paper, and that could trace a line through all of them. And so we have simple laws of physics. And on the other hand, the laws of physics are just so that we get the greatest possible variety in the universe. No two things are exactly alike. What might be the properties of God that would entail that the universe has to have that kind of structure? Simplicity and variety. How about the simplicity of the laws of nature? And we're finding out that they're not so simple in quantum mechanics. I think the simplicity would refer to God's perfection and rationality, but the variety, why would there have to be an infinite number of things with no two things being alike? I think that would refer to God's infinity, that God's creation has to reflect that variety and produce as many different things as it could. And so we have the one side, the physical side of the universe. It gives us simplicity and variety, and this very much resembles Leibniz's calculus, which I think we can see as being deeply connected to his overall metaphysical project here. Because what is it that the calculus shows us? It's so astonishing. It shows us things undergoing constant rates of change, such that at no instant are they exactly the same, but there are simple equations behind these things. And so he thinks that he's uncovering the thoughts of God here in the calculus. And then on the other hand, we have the moral dimension of the universe, which is much harder to swallow. He says that things are so orchestrated in the universe that they afford the greatest possibility of human happiness and morally perfecting ourselves. And that seems like a much more difficult one to swallow when we see so much misery in the world.
Yeah. How does God's infinity fare with like the best of all possible worlds? I might be like going back to something you already said, but it seems to be like tautological, what like what exists is the best because it exists, and it is like one set of infinity that contains that seems to not be truly, that would not be truly infinite because it does not contain anything but the best.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this would be the fight between Spinoza and Leibniz, right? And so, you know, Spinoza with reasoning like we find in certain elements of Descartes and certain elements of Leibniz, Spinoza is going to make the claim that perfection is not a real concept. And you know, what's he going to mean by that? He's going to mean that we can't give a sort of clear and distinct account of what perfection is. It's going to differ from person to person, and so we can't reason reliably from a concept like perfection. We're going to see these things different in different ways. You know, if you know, if you've been born with really poor health, your idea of what perfect health would be is going to be very different from somebody who was born in great health. If you've been hungry for much of your life because of where you came into the world, your idea of what a perfect meal is going to be very different than Donald Trump's children and the kind of meals that that they've eaten and so on. But you know, we have this issue: if the divine is truly infinite, how are we to account for how it limits itself in any way? Right? Wouldn't it produce everything that can be produced? And so why would we only go with the best of all possible universes? Why not all universes that can exist? And that's the route that Spinoza is going to take in his metaphysic, right? If it can exist, it will exist. All possible you know, variations of things will exist out there in the universe, probably all the way down to the different laws of physics that could exist, where gravity is a little bit stronger or weaker, and so on and so forth. How is it that that he's able to get to this sort of conclusion? And it's difficult. And I mean, you just get the sense as you're reading him, I do anyway, that he's like one of these acrobats with the plates on sticks. And so he has all of these plates that he has spinning around that he's trying to balance with each other, and they don't always fit so easily with each other. And so I mean, what do you guys think is the strangest doctrine that you came across in Leibniz's reasoning?
I just wanted to quickly say, since we already are mentioning like all of those strange dichotomies, when we're talking right in the beginning, when you mentioned rational versus revealed theology, I think that Leibniz certainly mixes those up. So it seems like he starts, especially on Discourse of Metaphysics, in monadology, it's much more concise, but in Discourse of Metaphysics, he starts off trying to just analyze concepts, be extremely rationalist, but then ends up specifically, because he needs to limit this Spinozist infinity, to pinpoint the fact that God has to choose. He seems to rely on Bible a lot. So, and that's the only way it seems that he can justify that God actually has free will, because we need to, he talks about love for creation and stuff, which can only be brought by him having freedom of choice in one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, it's something, I think it's something that is quite extraordinary that he does here with the revealed theology. And so where, and you know, I know I keep going back to Spinoza, I guess, but you know, where in Spinoza, with his rational theology, he's hardcore about it, right? I mean, he if you read the Theologico Politico treatise and you know, certain things he says in the ethics and everything, he's like, no, these are all anthropomorphizations. God can't be that way. They're fictions of the human mind, like, you know, the story of Daphne and Apollo and where bay leaves come from and all of that sort of stuff. He unequivocally goes with where his metaphysics leads him and uses that to dismiss or to discount certain teachings that we find in revealed theology. But again, the diplomat Leibniz, he's always trying to balance these things against each other. And, you know, he's a pretty clever intellect, I think. And so, you know, I don't know. It's hard for me to tell. Is this ironic what he's doing when he cites the scripture and everything like that, or is he drawing on these things as justification? It's hard to say, don't you think? Or what are you saying there, Tal? Maybe you could join us with your camera.
Tal, do you want to expound on, oh, okay.
Okay, no worries.
Here, I could read it. Best of all possible worlds might be a way of proving the existence of the world, and perhaps finding a principle of stability and consistency, which should give us some dimension of sense, meaning, or even freedom.
I mean, I think the issue of freedom here in Leibniz is a huge one, and you know, a very difficult one to make sense of within the framework of his metaphysics. And so, for me, the strangest claim that Leibniz makes is that each substance that exists, each monad, contains everything that will ever happen to it, past, present, and future. And so at one point he says that for every individual or substance that exists, there is a complete notion of it down to its tiniest predicate. And I mean, why do you think he would say something like that? What would lead him to such a strange view? And so you know, what he's saying is that, you know, for me, even though it seems as if right now I haven't said yet what I will say in the next 10 minutes or in the next hour or something like that, all of that is already contained within me, and it just needs to unfold. And so the you know, the sort of analogy that I like to think of when I'm trying to get my mind around what he's saying is, if I think about a DVD, when I'm watching the movie on the DVD, it seems like new events are happening, that you know, things that weren't there already are coming to be, and it seems like the things that happened earlier have now disappeared. But for Leibniz, no. All of those things are just as they would be on a DVD. They are already there, and each and every one of us. And so we merely unfold. And he puts it quite dramatically. I can't remember if it's in the Monadology or the Discourse on Metaphysics. He says, look, if God got really upset at me and he erased me from existence, you would still see me here for the remainder of this meeting, and would hear the remainder of my lecture, because the substances have no windows by which anything can come in or go out. You already contain within yourself somehow this entire lecture. So it's not me causing you to hear these words. It is these words unfolding from your own individual notion. And so that's the metaphysical level of things. And why is it that he is convinced that this has to be the case?
It's just maintaining his principles of identity and non-contradiction.
Exactly.
You,
I mean,
yeah.
go on.
Oh, no. I was, yeah, I mean, in order to never change, to be the same, to never not be yourself, you have to already be everything you will be.
Sounds like an army commercial. Be all that you can be.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. This is, and so, you know, if we go back to the Plato in the analogy of the divided line in the Republic, and why is it that Plato grants physical objects a lower degree of reality than the forms? It's because physical objects change. They are contradictory. What they are today is different than what they were yesterday and what they will be tomorrow. And like Leibniz, he is committed to the thesis that the universe has a rational structure. And so if they violate the principle of identity, they have to be further away from being real. In Leibniz, it's a very different way. Leibniz thinks that this suggestion that all of these things that exist, that they're mere illusions, is preposterous. That we can't, especially from the Christian framework that he's coming from, that we can't discount the existences, the entities. And maybe there he's influenced by Thomas Aquinas, you know, with his emphasis on the existent. And so what is the other possibility? It is to say that no, how can we save the object? It's only a sort of an illusion that they're contradictory or that they're changing. All of these things are already contained within them. And so, boom, right now we can preserve these monads, we can preserve these substances in a way that accords with the demands of reason or rationality. But if this is the case, we get a whole new set of problems, right? Because if I already contain everything in me, past, present, and future, how are we to account for choice, as Tal is bringing up here, and freedom? It seems as if I was fated from the very beginning to do what it is that I will do. And in a certain sense, Leibniz has to say this, because if he's going to grant God every perfection that is possible for God, then he's going to have to grant omniscience, which means that God is going to have to see from the very beginning of time what it is that each and every one of us would do. Yet, by the same token, if the universe isn't to be a horrible place, again, undermining God's perfection, we have to be the ones that are responsible for what we do, not God. And what is the heroic thing that he tries to do? He tries to draw this distinction between necessary truths on the one hand that can't be otherwise without a contradiction, and then the contingent truths where, yeah, that's the only possibility that could have followed from that antecedent, that premise, if P then Q, but P didn't have to be the case. But it seems to me, you know, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this, Jacob, because I know your theology is in a very different place. It seems to me that this is very strange, because as Deleuze is later on going to point out in the Fold, or maybe it's Difference in Repetition, Leibniz's God is still choosing the world in which Adam would necessarily sin. And doesn't that then mean that there's still a sense in which God is responsible for Adam sinning, and we should find Adam innocent?
I think there's another aspect of this that I found really interesting when reading, and that has to do with the physicality of bodies. So it seems that within Leibniz's system, there's like the soul, which is its own substance, and then the physicality, which is its own substance, and they're in the preordained harmony with one another. But he does seem to suggest that there's some sort of like necessary relationship between the soul and the body. And what I was interested when reading is how this is how this could potentially be problematized with death. So when I die, my body, it's buried or cremated or whatnot, and the particles of my body are eaten by bacteria. Or I don't know exactly how the process works, right? But the particles that constitute my body right now will disperse and unfold into new things, perhaps new people. And this is all preordained at the beginning of the universe. And I was just wondering how that interacts with that necessity of my body being tied to my soul. Is my body a substance? Are the individual cells within my body a substance? How do these things interact in such a way? And how does that mess with things about the body and the soul being tied together?
Does anybody have responses to this? I mean, one thing for me, the relationship between the body and the soul in Leibniz, or material reality and spiritual reality, is really vexed. And my understanding of it, and I'm definitely by no means a Leibniz expert, my understanding of it is that there are a lot of interpretive debates in the secondary literature as to whether or not there is any material reality for Leibniz. It seems like he can just get rid of all of that and just have these notions. He could be a kind of quasi-idealist in a certain way. But the other thing, if and I think it comes out maybe more in the monadology than in the discourse on metaphysics, for Leibniz, and it cracks me up, for Leibniz, nothing is ever destroyed. It just goes to sleep. It falls into a very deep slumber. And so you can exhaust the sort of DVD that you are, the program that you are, and unfold all of your potentialities or your powers. And you aren't dispersed. You don't go into other things. You just kind of fold into yourself and slumber with the possibility of being resurrected or coming back at some point in time. And again, part of this is the motivation. It's that principle of identity lurking in the background again. If we take the principle of identity seriously for any substance, then no substance can ultimately be destroyed. And so, like I said at the beginning of our discussions here today, I said I think he's batshit crazy insane, but beautifully, marvelously so, because the sort of rigor and consistency with which he carries out this program. Because now, of course, if we say that everything that ever happens to us is contained within us already, we're going to need a whole new, which, by the way, means that every experience that we have is innate. Think about that for a second. It's not coming from the world. The idea of empirical observation for Leibniz is going to be a kind of an illusion, a well-founded one, but it's not going to be the way things are. We're going to need a whole new theory of cognition as a result of this hypothesis, and we're going to need to explain the relationships between all of these different substances or monads. And what is the beautiful idea that he has here? It's this idea that things don't causally interact. It's not that the ball hitting me in the head causes my pain and touches my head in some way or another or something like that. It's that all of these substances unfold in tandem with one another, synchronously with one another, coordinated with one another, giving rise to the illusion that they are causing and affecting one another. And so while it might seem to me from the standpoint of the phenomenal level that when you said something just now, Jacob, you were causally modifying me, causing my eardrum to vibrate and everything like that, and giving me the thoughts that I have. It wasn't that way at all. It was that I already had within myself this experience, and this unfolds from the preceding ideas that I have in my mind, giving rise to that experience simultaneously with you unfolding in the same way. That would be the metaphysical level. Does that make sense? Have I said it clearly enough? I mean, it's a really difficult point, I think, to put into speech. All right, so let's take about 10 or 15 minutes for a break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about this idea of the harmony among all the monads or the substances. I think here we're beginning to approach where a concept of the fold might be at work in Leibniz, and a couple of possibilities that we could develop without having to commit ourselves to the details of his own metaphysics. Sound good?
Sounds good. So 10 minutes?
10 minutes, sounds good. All right. So welcome back to the second half. Of Ontologies of the Full, the first meeting, and hopefully you're finding all of this interesting, and this Leibniz isn't too basic for all of you. So did anybody care to start us off?
Artem, maybe?
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I'm not sure what would you want to touch upon, because I had a question relating to modernity. I don't have much relating to harmony, other than when talking about perishing substances, we mentioned that yes, the monads do not kind of go away, they're slowly going to sleep, but there's also this really weird relation when he says that apart from just body having a soul, kind of every part and every limb of the body also has a soul. So there is a kind of a very strange intersection of monads, and of course not intersection because they don't have windows, but there seems to be a very weird relation of the mechanism that God in Leibniz's view set up, that in one way or another, I just am not specifically sure why he would rather say that their bodies are this gigantic amount, a very complex apparatus, which is kind of created by combination of monads rather than just one monad. Why can't there be one monad that has this kind of ability to perceive and to be perceived, and that would go alongside the laws of non-contradiction and with the laws of identity? Why this kind of very strange operation of including almost an infinite amount of monads to one body?
Can you point us to a passage where
I'll try. It's in the nomadology.
right?
Monadology. So sorry. I think talks about limbs. So yeah. So I think it's passage 70. From this, we see that each living body has a dominant, that I understand, entelechy, which in the animal is the soul, but the limbs of this living body are full of other living things, plants, animals, each of which also has its dominant entelechy or soul. So it's
Where is this again?
Monadology, passage 70.
70.
Yes.
All right, so we can see from this that every living body has one dominant entelechy, which in an animal is its soul. But the parts of that living body are full of other living beings, plants, animals, each of which also has its entelechy or dominant soul. And he says we can see from this, and so that we would assume he's referring to the previous paragraph, right? Thus, there is nothing barren, sterile, dead in the universe, nothing chaotic, nothing confused except in appearance. Here's an example of that, and I love this. It's one of my favorite passages in all of Leibniz. If you see a pond from a certain distance, you may see the swirling of the fish without being able to pick out any individual fish. It may seem that you are seeing a confused, oh wait, I'm thinking of a different passage. Seeing confused movements of the fish, but really nothing is confused in itself. What's happening here is that you are perceiving confusedly. I mean, do you care to hazard a, yeah, I'm thinking of passage 67. Every portion of matter can be thought of as a garden full of plants or pond full of fish, but every branch of the plant, every part of the animal, every drop of its vital fluids even is another such garden or pond. And although the earth and air separating the plants in the garden and the water separating the fish in the pond are not themselves plants or fish, They contain other organisms, but usually ones that are too small for us to perceive them. I mean, do you care to hazard a guess here?
Well, it seems like he's trying to refer to the fact that there are just there are some self-sustained organisms that are living kind of inside, just as fish in the water and so on. It does seem, I completely understand that even on a biological level, this is true, that the fact that there are self-sustained organisms that are adding up to other self-sustained organisms, but at the same time, what I'm really troubled by is I'm not sure how do we fathom, like in a Descartesian manner, this relation between body and soul once we say that, well, body also has a bunch of other monads, a bunch of other souls. Even though it has a predominant one, it seems like I'm just not sure. I'm not even sure what to say here. I'm just confused a little bit by that.
I am too. And I mean, for me, I find these sorts of passages deeply mysterious. In the metaphysics he seems to be developing. How did you put it at the beginning? Like, why not just one big monad that contains all of these things? It sounds like he's suggesting here that these monads are composite, like a Greek atomist might talk about things. They're composed of other things. But that seems to be very much, to my thinking, in tension with the overall logic of his argument. And so, I mean, maybe some of you have a hypothesis here that might shed light on this.
I can't remember where he says it, but doesn't he say that each monad or each substance contains the whole of the universe within itself? And so I don't know if that means like that there's literally a physical element to that thing within it, but if each monad doesn't have a window exterior to itself in the world, then it must contain all the things that it perceives itself interacting with, if that makes sense. And that's what I think he's trying to suggest, that within the school of fish is the perception of me by that school of fish. So I don't know. It doesn't seem like a physical containment of all these different things, but on a different sort of perceptual level. But I could be off there. This is just how I kind of understood it, or tried to understand it.
I mean, it seems like what you're referring to, and it's something that appears both in the discourse and in the monadology, is a slightly different issue than the one that Artem is raising in paragraph 70. And so in the discourse on metaphysics, section 9, that's where we get the thesis that each monad contains or mirrors the entire universe from a particular point of view. And so in paragraph 9 there, he says, several considerable paradoxes follow from this, amongst others. It is never true that two substances are entirely alike, differing only in being two rather than one. It also follows that a substance cannot begin except by creation, nor can come to an end except by annihilation. Because one substance can't be destroyed by being split up, they're all indivisible. And so this is foreshadowing later on what we're going to get from the theory of the monad. Or brought into existence by assembling its parts. And that's what makes this so confusing, right? Because in Artem's passage, it sounds like he's saying that these bodies are assembled by parts, right? Is that what you're getting at? But he's saying right here that, and he says it in the monadology as well, that they have no parts. And so that makes no sense. In the natural course of events, the number of substances remains the same, although all substances are often transformed. And so there's a constant number of substances in the entire universe, It never changes. And this goes back to, I think, what you were talking about earlier, Jacob, when you talked about us being dispersed. For Leibniz, no, nothing is ever dispersed. The number of monads or substances is constant. Moreover, each substance is like a whole world and like a mirror of God, or indeed of the whole universe, with which each substance expresses in its own fashion, rather as the same town looks different according to the position from which it is viewed. In a way, then, the universe is multiplied as many times as there are substances, and in the same way, the glory of God is magnified by so many quite different representations of his work. It could even be said that each substance carries within it, in a certain way, the imprint of God's infinite wisdom and omnipotence, and imitates him as far as it can, for it expresses, though confusedly, everything that happens in the universe, past, present, and future. And this is a little like infinite perception or knowledge. And as all the other substances express this one in their turn and adapt themselves to it, that is, they are as they are because of it as it is, it can be said to have a power over all the others, imitating the Creator's omnipotence. And so, you know, we have two concepts of the fold at work here that I think Deleuze is going to play on later on in the Leibniz book, Leibniz and the Broke. On the one hand, right, the terminology of folding and unfolding is going to be really important to Deleuze in that book. He's going to talk about how the monads unfold themselves. And when he talks about how they unfold themselves, that's not just going to be a developmental thesis about how they go from one state to another and becoming the sort of organism that they are, but that's also going to be experience as well. Experience is something that unfolds, and it finds its principle from within the monad. It's not, as I was saying before the break, it's not that there's a causal interaction between monads. It's that everything that I experience and I think arises from my preceding thought in some way. It's already contained within me, and it just needs to unfold. And I take it this is what he has in mind when he says that the monads and the substances have no windows or doors by which anything could go out or go in. It's a very difficult theory of cognition to think about because we're so accustomed to think in information theoretical terms of receiving something from the outside and then processing it in some way, giving rise to an experience. For Leibniz, it doesn't work that way at all. The monads unfold what is already virtually contained within them. On the other side of the equation, though, we have a very different concept of the fold, the way in which, that might be, Tal, I would have to hear more about the philosophy of recognition there. But on the other side of the equation, we have this idea that the monads mirror the entire universe from a particular point of view. There's a way in which all the rest of the events that take place in the universe, past, present, and future, are unfolded within the are enfolded within the monad in a unique way, which I guess is what he's talking about as a point of view, that then are given expression as that monad unfolds them. And so that's about relationships between the monads. And this is where we get the famous concept in Leibniz of compossibility, right? All of the monads, all of the substances that exist, they have relationships of what Leibniz calls compossibility. They are coordinated with one another. And how to explain this concept? The universe in which Caesar crosses the Rubicon can only occur in the universe in which Judas betrays Jesus or in which Adam sins. All of these things form a sort of web of dependent interrelationships that are still nonetheless independent somehow of each other. An incompossible universe would be where all these points of view don't converge upon one another. And maybe that's what Tal is getting at a little bit with against the philosophy of recognition. In Leibniz, all of these points of view have to converge on an identical and self-same universe. Deleuze wants to push this later on and develop the idea of incompossible universes where things don't have to converge with one another. We can have divergent universes. Does that make any sense, or?
The only thing that I wanted to ask is the question about point of view. So since monads are not at all extended or have any physical representation, I was just wondering whether points of view were in some way talking about their will, knowledge, and power, or how do the points of view change? Because monads seem to be only relational in terms of power, knowledge, and will.
Can you expand on that?
Well,
this is where you're seeing the connection with Nietzsche, maybe?
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. So I might be being a little bit speculative on this, but in monadology, when he talks about God as having power, let me check my notes quickly, if I may. Yeah, so God possesses power, subject or basis, knowledge, the perceptive faculty, and will, appetitive faculty. And it seems that there is a continuation of that that is giving to other monads. And it seems like this is the only three faculties through which the monads actually differ, because for them to occupy a space, they would have to be to possess any kind of shape or physical qualities, which they don't. They simply have those three relations, right?
And what were they? They were power, will,
and knowledge, if I'm not mistaken.
And so what is, and so your question is, how does this relate to point of view?
Yeah, I'm just, I'm a bit confused here because, well, in regular basis, you would say point of view is just a physical stance, and that would understand like the perceptive things. And I think Leibniz does kind of, I don't remember in which paragraph exactly, but he does talk about us seeing things from a different perspective physically, but it seems like it cannot be applicable here. It doesn't make sense if you talk about physical points of view and applying that to monads.
Where is this?
What exactly?
Yeah, which paragraph? And in monadology or the discourse of metaphysics?
I think it's monadology, and you're talking about the power, knowledge, and will, or?
Mm-hmm.
That's, if I'm not mistaken, 47. 46, 47. Oh, 48.
Oh, I'm sitting here looking for the monadology, and I had it elsewhere. 48. Okay, so this is his summary of God. He says, in God, there is power, which is the true source of everything. Then knowledge, which contains every single idea. And then finally, will, which produces changes in accordance with the principle of what is best. And these are what correspond, respectively, to what in the created monad constitute the subject or base, or basic nature of the monad itself. And so he's saying what? The basic nature of the monad is going to be power, right? And then we have the faculty of perception, and then the appetitive faculty. But in God, these attributes are absolutely infinite or perfect, whereas in created monads, they're only imitations of the divine attributes, imitations that are more or less close, depending on how much perfection they possess. And so maybe you can, pull out a little bit what question you're asking here. I'm having difficulty.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether the points of view, so it seems like it's central to the entire concept of a monad that it has a perspective of a certain thing, that it somehow can represent the world. And I'm just wondering if, in your opinion, somehow, because I don't see distinct collection, those faculties of power, perception, and appetite faculty, which are supposed to be the only things that are actually making up, in a very weird sense, a monad, how do they kind of reference to the possibility of a different perception?
And when you say a different perception, do you mean another monad's perception?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And I mean, what's the answer here?
Well, it seems that it's specifically connected. Well, it seems like there is no other kind of predicate that can belong to a monad that ever could present a different point of view. And it seems, and here, for this seems somehow very Nietzschean, despite Leibniz being a very kind of dualistic philosopher. It seems like power, when he talks about like dominance of intellect over bodies and certain souls, and it seems like power has a lot at stake here, and it seems maybe that points of view are those differential power strata in one way or another. It's something in regards, I don't know, I really want to connect it even to like slave morality or something like that, the slave master dichotomy. But it seems like it's there's something interesting going on here, and I just can't pinpoint it down.
Do others have thoughts here in response to these questions? John Michael?
I was suffering without thoughts. Sorry about that.
You were suffering without thought.
That's right.
I mean, I think, and I could be wrong here, is I think that the answer is they don't reference other perceptions. And so, I mean, again, we have to go back to this thing that the monads have no doors or windows by which anything can come in or go out. And it's this incredibly difficult theory of cognition and perception to get your head around. There isn't a transfer of information from one monad to another. There isn't a perception of another monad. Everything that happens inside of the monad comes from the monad itself. And so the power of the monad isn't power over, it is that, I'm struggling with words here, it is that unfolding of these things within itself, and what drives that unfolding is the appetition that leads it from one perception to another. Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is, as Tal says, it is a becoming within the monad. But the strange thing is it seems like it's a kind of sterile becoming, because each monad contains everything within it that will ever happen to it, past, present, and future. And so, you know, in the sense of a becoming in the Bergsonian sense, or maybe Nietzsche's sense, or Deleuze's sense, it doesn't really seem like anything new is coming into the universe in Leibniz's universe. It's again, it's like placing that DVD in the player and turning it on, and the movie goes, but the movie was already there.
But then there's this part of like the miracles, and like it says something about like how God chooses certain like I don't know, like substances to create like this kind of miracle. But then he like continues saying that then like this is part of like the harmony of God's will. So like even this like miracle that could be the new, like I don't know, like yeah, like something that's wasn't there before, then appears as the will of God.
Thoughts here? I'm processing that in my mind, Eduardo.
Where does he reference miracles, Eduardo?
Oh, it's the middle section of the Discourse on Metaphysics.
Okay.
Is a great deal of it is devoted to miracles.
It's on the 16.
In Discourse, right?
Yeah.
Paragraph 16?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and what it is that Leibniz says throughout is that the only thing in the universe that can influence other monads is God. God is the only thing. The monads can't influence each other. And so it's this really, really strange doctrine that's following from the principle of identity. You know, I think maybe the way all of us think about it in this room is that when we look at the tree outside of my window, somehow, you know, light is bouncing off of the tree and it's traveling through and it's hitting the rods and cones of my eyes, causing them to behave in a certain way, giving me the image of the tree. In Leibniz, it doesn't happen that way at all. There is no thing that is transmitted between monads. This is the strangest aspect of his doctrine. If God annihilated that tree, if God destroyed that tree, I would still have the experience of the tree if that was a part of my internal monad to have that experience. Because I don't require the tree to exist in order to see the tree, to sit on it, and all of these sorts of things. These are inner perceptions of my being that merely unfold or actualize themselves over time. And so, you know, what is the thesis here about the harmony of the universe? It's that all of the monads have been created in a way that they parallel one another and they unfold from different points of view without interacting with each other. If we think about it, and I think maybe even Bennett, the translator, and these are quite good translations. We're lucky to have, are you all using the Bennett translations online from the Modern Library? They're quite good. And so we're fortunate to have access to those if you use those ones. But I think Bennett, in an aside in brackets, gives an example. Imagine that you have two pendulums swinging back and forth, and you are looking at these two pendulums swinging, although we can't look at anything in Leibniz, and they're in perfect unison with one another. And we think maybe that one pendulum is causing the other pendulum to swing that way, even though their movement is completely independent of one another. There is no causal interaction between these two pendulums. It's a kind of an illusion that one is affecting the other, or we might think of two dancers, right? The one isn't causing the other one to dance in perfect synchronicity. It's each one individually that's doing this. And God has created the universe in such a way that for everything in the universe, they're harmonized. And then, as Eduardo is drawing our attention to, and admittedly, I didn't pay too close of an attention to his discussion of miracles. But on the one hand, there are these sorts of laws of physics, which really are just mathematical. for Leibniz, which is the ordinary patterns of how things are going to behave according to God, the architect, who's a sort of grand poobah mathematician, or as I like to call him, mathemagician. And then on the other hand, occasionally God is going to somehow intervene to produce these miracles that, while they don't violate, what does he call them, Eduardo, again? The subordinate laws? Do you remember? Occasionally, God's going to intervene to produce these extraordinary events that are somehow consistent with the order of nature of his creation, but are extraordinary. And I'm a little bit unclear on his account of the miraculous here. I'm not sure if he was taking the Spinozist route. And so what is it that Spinoza tries to do in a great deal of the Tractatus? He tries to show that these things that we call miracles can actually happen through natural causes, like maybe there was a big gust of wind on the day that the Red Sea was parted or something like that. He gives us natural reading of the miraculous stories. Is he trying to take that route? And he's saying all of these things can happen according to the laws of physics and mathematics. Or is he saying that occasionally God intervenes in a way that violates these principles to bring about the miraculous? And then we have to ask, well, gosh, if God is such a good designer, if he creates a perfectly well-designed universe, why should we have any miracles at all? Because it seems like fudging things, to me anyway, like there was some sort of glitch, like in the second Matrix film, that required God's intervention in order to be surmounted or overcome. And that's a strange thing. But I think there's also some question as to, I was surprised going back to it this time.
I just found the place where he talks about overriding subordinate rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, don't you find the passage really ambiguous as to what he's saying? If we take the subordinate rules to be the ordinary laws of physics, how things happen, how they fall, he says they conform to those rules. And so that seems to be that they are within the framework of science, but they somehow override them at the same time in the sense that they are out of the ordinary. And I'm not at all sure how to interpret this. Is he making a claim like my friend Noah Horowitz does, that I went to grad school with, in his writings on God and religion and Kabbalah and all this sort of stuff, where Noah delves into the physics and he says, look, right, according to the laws of physics, things can just dematerialize. It's within the realm of possibility for atomic physics. Or that a hand can go through a wall. It's not something that ordinarily happens, but it's something that can happen. Is Leibniz saying something like that? Or is he saying that these miracles are, in the more traditional, robust sense of a miracle, something that actually violates the laws of physics? And that's what gives them, are they just extraordinary or unusual, or...
I mean, he does talk about them being orderly, so that would imply that they would be in a certain kind of harmony with all the other laws. So it does seem that, well, here I'm not sure, because, I mean, God is still a monad. It's just a kind of, it's the primal monad, so I'm not sure it could directly influence them as like Hume would perceive God influencing something. It would seem to be just some kind of a very extraordinary event that is harmonized with the entire world, yet just didn't show up at a certain point. But yeah, I may not be sure. He does explicitly say that even miracles are orderly.
Because God has to do things in an orderly way, according to Leibniz. But what does that mean? I find it deeply mysterious. And this morning, for example, I was reading a news story, or actually my wife was telling me about a story where a woman got pregnant while she's pregnant. And so this is something that doesn't ordinarily happen. It's incredibly rare, but it's still apparently something that can happen. And so that might be a miraculous event in the sense that Leibniz is talking about. That would be the more Spinoza sort of direction, that nothing is really truly miraculous. It's just very, very improbable and unusual that the wind would be blowing in that precise way on that particular day when Moses came to the Red Sea and the Egyptians were chasing him. I mean, and so that's something that is unlikely to happen, but maybe it can happen. Or when he says it's orderly, does he mean that it's a part of God's plan and these are violations of those mathematical laws? And I couldn't discern. I mean, Eduardo, do you have a take on this? Do you have a position as to what he's saying?
I am thinking of like quantum computers and quantum internet, because from what I can understand of that stuff is like they use like some orderly they orderly use quantum mechanics to create computation, like to process information, but at the end this happens at such a small scale that it's not like anything weird for us, like it's something that, yes, quantum physics is regarded as like spooky and whatever, but it's happening at such a small level that we cannot perceive it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's maybe something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking of as well. But I also wonder, is a quantum universe consistent with a Leibnizian universe? Because you have all sorts of weirdness in the quantum universe. You have, things that seem to be popping in and out of existence, out of nowhere, which seems like it wouldn't work in the Leibnizian universe. They can jump all over the place. They can be in multiple places at once, and so on and so forth. I don't know. Yeah. I feel like we've gotten a little bit of drift from Artem's original questions about power, though. I mean, do we get any clarity on that particular issue? And there is this whole theme about power during this time period that you find in Thomas Hobbes, and then Spinoza, and Leibniz, and there is a certain way in which it culminates, maybe in Nietzsche, and then it kind of disappears for a while, doesn't it? In philosophy, and then we've seen a resurrection of it as a result of the more Spinozist orientations of Deleuze. But I think there's very much a debate going on here as well as to just what power is, how we're supposed to conceptualize it. And everybody falls into silence.
Artem, do you want to respond to that? See if that met your question.
Yeah. Well, I didn't have a question per se. It was mostly just a hint, I guess, in my own head about something that might be happening here. But that's for some reason, when we're talking about powers being the kind of the center of the monad, something that truly is a bit even above knowledge and will, that felt very Deleuzean reading of Nietzsche to me. So I thought I would point that out. Other than that, in regards to the debate in regards to power that is happening at that time, what's interesting is maybe this kind of connection with Bacon and science as being, and knowledge as being this kind of sort of, as knowledge as being a specific tool of power. But other than that, I'm really a bit lost. It's more of an interesting thing. It doesn't seem like he really takes those three things. Knowledge and will, I see how he takes those away in how he ascribes them to God, but power, it just seems to be going out of nowhere. It just seems that he really needs something to satisfy the requirements to give birth to will and knowledge, and power just kind of pops up there. You don't find anything about power in the monadology before that. So
how are you thinking about power?
Well, I guess it's some kind of, well, it should be perfect one way or another, because God possesses the perfect power, so it has to have a perfect quality to it. And it's something maybe that is, yeah, I've been thinking about it in a Nietzschean sense, because it's the only sense in which I can make sense of it. It's some sort of just a driving force. It's something that simply cannot be other way but acting. But other than that, and I feel like that would explain the perceptions being caused and unfolding. It's something that simply just cannot be stopped. Something that, when Adorno says in the beginning, like that the human becomes enlightened right when the first thought appears. So when the first thought kind of, it just pops out, then it cannot help but be transgressive and unfolding. And that seems to be a very interesting way to interpret that, maybe. But I may be just bullshitting as well. So,
I mean, in Spinoza, right, there's a deep connection between power and knowledge. The more perfect my knowledge is, the more active I am, the greater my power. And so the more I think through my intellect, I'm thinking through causes, somehow I'm enhancing my power. And maybe something similar to that is going on in the case of Leibniz as well. There's the thing that I don't quite get, and there's something similar in Spinoza as well, where he suggests that the more active I am, the more perfect I am in a certain way, which seems like a strange equation to me. Whereas the more I'm acted upon, the more passive I am, and maybe you would feel this way with your Nietzscheanism, the more imperfect I am. And so I can't remember where he says it, if it's in the discourse or in the monadology. He says something like there's always a certain joy associated with activity and a certain sadness with passivity, which sounds very much like this Spinoza's conception of power. But why, first off, how can anything be passive in the Leibnizian universe if we've gotten his doctrine of substance and the monads right, and maybe we've gotten them wrong? And on the other hand, if somehow we can be passive in that universe, why should that be associated with a certain sort of sadness or imperfection, simply because I'm being acted upon by something? I think I'm getting it, as I try and think through this, I'm getting a better sense of where you're talking about the doctrine of forces in Nietzsche as Deleuze develops it in that first chapter, right?
Yeah, and I feel like will has even some sort of a conception of being sense. So power being power, and will and knowledge as being kind of sense. It's being the vectors that are guiding the magnitude.
Tal, do you want to say what you think is important about the concept of intellecty? I confess that I take it as being somewhat synonymous with monad, but of course he wouldn't have introduced a separate term unless he wanted some sort of nuance there to come out. I think Tal is asking you a question, Artem.
So sorry. Well, he does say that he's introducing that term based on the Greek meanings of self-sufficiency and perfection. So in one way or another, monads can be called that way because they are perfect and they are self-sufficient. They don't need, they have this kind of Aristotelian substance to them, in the sort of thing that they don't need anything else to sustain them. But a bit more of a radical version then would be that they actually also are perfect in their own way. Well, intellect. Sorry. It's just it feels like intellect.
Passages in the monadology, just so we can.
Hmm?
Where are the passages that we have in mind with the intellects here?
Tal, do you have a passage?
19, I think.
Okay, so we have 18, and in my translation, the Bennett translation, he has in brackets here a little introduction to the concept of intellect. He says the word intellecti used in this section is a Greek label that Leibniz gives to monads, especially when he wants to emphasize the monad's role as a source of power, energy, or the like. He connects it here with the monad's perfection, apparently meaning this in the sense of, and this is what you're referring to, right? Of completeness, self-sufficiency, causal power. In 62, he will connect enteleki with the monad's central role in the life of the body, of which it is the soul. And so he says, we could give the name enteleki to all simple substances or created monads because they have within them a certain perfection. And so they aren't perfect. That would be too strong, right, to say that they're perfect. They have a certain perfection. There is a kind of, and I think Leibniz, at least in works I've read on him, was kind of terrified of being a Spinozist and being accused of Spinozism. And so he's really walking this kind of razor thin line, because in Spinoza, everything goes to the sort of striving to go to the sort of limit of what it can do, as degrees of being, powers of being. There's a kind of self-sufficiency which makes them sources of their own internal action, makes them immaterial. That's such an interesting expression. Immaterial automata, as it were. And that's a striking comment on his part. And then you said 19, in this section, the French word sentiment is left untranslated. If we are willing to label as a soul anything that has perceptions and appetites, in the general sense that I have just explained, then all simple substances, all created monads, could be called souls. But as there is a more to sentiment than mere perception, I think the general name monad or intellecti is adequate for substances that have mere perception and nothing more, and that we should reserve soul for the ones with perceptions that are more distinct and accompanied by memory. In this context, I shall use the phrase mere monad to mean a monad whose perceptions have nothing special about them, are not distinct or accompanied by memory, are merely perceptions with nothing more to be said about them.
Yeah, and the thing that I was also wondering quickly is that we have established then if somehow God will be extremely pissed at me and just ushers me from existence, everybody else will still, it's like there will be still a functionless unity. So I had a question I had a question which basically was, what is God exactly raising? So functionally, practically, in a sense idea, is he erasing my intentionality in a Husserlian sense, or is he erasing some kind of object, but it seems not to be an object belonging to the world because the world kind of stays the same. Nothing is being left out of any other monad, because those are just mere reflections of everything happening. So we will still get access to all future, past, and present events.
Does anybody want to express that? You know, Tal has brought up here the issue of the principle of indiscernibles. And so what is it going to be that distinguishes Artem here from Artem's twin, is maybe one way we might start by tackling this question. He says that the difference can't come down to spatial location, that you can't have two things that have an identical notion, but just have a different place in space. And so it seems to me, what is it that's ultimately going to distinguish Artem from his twin? Okay. What is it that's going to distinguish Artem from his twin? I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that there's only one possible answer here, and that you are going to be slightly different metaphysical points of view on the universe. So you're going to express the universe in slightly different ways. There's going to have to be some sort of notional difference if we could see all the predicates that that belong to you. And so then getting to your question, what's really being erased would be one. I mean, first off, we know that nothing can be erased in the universe. Why do we know that nothing can be erased in the universe?
Would it kill the principle of harmony?
It's because God's a perfect, it's always going to be the same answer, right? God's a perfect being, and if God's a perfect being, what's that going to mean? It's going to be God can't make a mistake. And the only way that Artem could be erased is if God somehow made a mistake. John
Or
Michael,
if it was preordained.
hold on a second. Okay. What's that, Jacob?
Or if it was preordained that God knew from the beginning he would erase Artem at some point. I don't know how that would work, but could God have preordained this erasure? It probably doesn't matter, but.
No, I mean, I think it's a really good question, right? Because doesn't this question really approach the issue of miracles and, you know, the metaphysical status of miracles in Leibniz's universe? Because we have this whole issue of craftsmanship of the universe. And, you know, so he has this nice answer. And I don't know if you would agree with me, Jacob, but I mean, don't you think that there's something somewhat from the framework of a certain kind of religious experience intuitive about Leibniz's answer? When somebody loses their kid or something like that, it gets run over by a truck chasing a ball, like in Pet Sematary. You know, what is it that they say to make themselves feel better? They say, well, it must have happened for a reason. That something good, I don't know what that reason is, but something good must come out of this. And Leibniz has just formalized that way of thinking about, there's some really atrocious passages in there. What is it that he talks about? He talks about the city that gets hit by the tidal wave because they must have been sinful or horrible people. And you're just like, Jesus Christ, you know, Leibniz, what is wrong with you when you say something like this? But he's formalizing that kind of reasoning. And so we have this whole question about the status of craftsmanship. That in this translation, in my translation that I'm using, in the discourse, it says God created a perfect universe. But a lot of what he says seems to suggest that it's not perfect, it's the best universe.
Well, he says most perfect,
very,
right?
very different things, right?
He says most perfect, right? Only God is absolutely perfect. Everything else is most perfect.
Does he use the term most perfect in the discourse?
Yeah, I don't, in one of them he uses most perfect throughout it. I can't remember which one. But like God is absolutely perfect, but everything else is just the most perfect. And I have a hypothesis on the miracles based on my hypothesis on God preordaining the removal of Artem from the universe. And it possibly comes down to what Leibniz means by miracles. Do miracles happen every day, or is he just trying to shoehorn in like the biblical examples of miracles into his system because he doesn't want to be an atheist, or he doesn't want to deny the Holy Scripture? And I wonder if it's possible that God could have preordained the action of certain miracles, such as in Scripture, the miracles performed by Christ, in order to show Christ's divinity. So that these miracles fit into the order preordained from the very beginning, because God had planned for Christ to show his divinity through these miracles. In which case, they would fit within the system of preordained harmony and everything. They might mess with the rules of physics a little bit, but I don't even know if they have to there. But this preordination from the very beginning in order to show Christ's divinity. And I get the impression throughout reading Leibniz that he's trying to shoehorn Christianity into this system that he has working very well, right? So he comes up with a logical explanation of God, and the logical explanation of God works very well, but then he starts talking about God in this sense that's not even, that seems more biblical than the logical God that he's come up with. And so I wonder if that's the thing about miracles, whether he's just trying to shoehorn Christianity into the system or not.
So, Jacob, are you making the claim that he's not necessarily as rational and deductive as he would like to be, that there's a little bit of jerry-rigging things going on here, or ad hoc?
I think he's starting with certain presuppositions about God, and he wants to fit those into his system. And so I wouldn't go so far to say as the system's not logically consistent. It might not be, but I can't provide evidence that it's not. But I think he does start with certain presuppositions behind that system that aren't necessarily explained.
Yeah. I mean, and then, he's, in a certain sense, of course, we have the exploration of the Americas and, the encounter with the East going on and all of this sort of stuff. But like once you start thinking anthropologically, it becomes very difficult to know what to do with this kind of Christocentrism in his philosophy. Like on the one hand, we can see, again, Leibniz, the diplomat, he's trying to balance all these things. And so you get he preserves the kernel of truth for the Calvinists with predetermination and, grace and everything from a certain point of view, that all of these outcomes are known and everything. But on the other hand, the more Catholic, position that we have agency and free will, he preserves. He's trying to heroically preserve as well and mash these two positions together. I'm not sure how well it all ultimately works. I would probably go with what you're saying, though, that he wants that place of miracle. His account would be to show the divinity of Christ or something like that, that we have to have these miraculous events to function as almost like a phenomenological epoche, to suspend everything just being the laws of physics. And there's this other metaphysical dimension as well that needs to be in our thought. Yeah, well, it's absolutely teleological. It's all some sort of purpose. Whether or not there's really time in Leibniz's system, I think that's a question that's worth thinking about. All right, so that's about all we have time for tonight. I wanted to take a few minutes before we wrapped this up. Usually at the beginning of class, I have all of you give an introduction of yourself at the beginning of the seminars. We skipped over that step today. And so maybe each one of you could tell me a little bit about yourself and your background. Eduardo, we'll start. We'll pick on you first.
Oh, well, I am from Mexico City. And
From where?
Mexico City.
Oh,
and I am a filmmaker.
Mexico City.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose I make experimental films, and I am one of those persons that thinks that film is a way of to think. So for the same reason, I'm really interested in reading and in philosophy.
excellent. Maybe you can make us a Leibnizian film.
Yeah, maybe, perhaps for the final assignment, I will make a film instead of an essay.
Oh, absolutely. That is totally within the realm of possibility about, folds or any of the stuff that we look at. But I love those sorts of projects and would be delighted to see something like that. Jacob, you're up next.
So my academic background kind of goes all over the place. I got a BA in political science in undergrad with a minor in philosophy. But I found myself really interested in like the epistemological underpinnings of the field more so than political science itself, and interest in like the political theory aspects more so than the science aspects of the field. And then I went off and did library school at the University of British Columbia. And again, I found myself more interested in like the ethical underpinnings of librarianship more so than the more technical and useful aspects of actually being a librarian. And so I kind of found myself here at the New Center, and I'm a student at the New Center. I'm in this class because I'm interested in Deleuze. Deleuze's interest in power, I think, is something that I find really interesting. I find the intersection of Deleuze and Foucault very interesting, and something I'm really excited about. This class is that I've been reading a lot of Virilio recently, and Virilio actually mentions Deleuze's topology in his Leibniz book in one aspect when Virilio is talking about his own architectural pursuits. And I'm really interested in how Virilio's architecture intersects with his politics. And so I think that a similar sort of thing can be done here with Deleuze's fold, and thinking about how the fold could possibly work politically in the same way as Virilio's oblique architecture works politically in his work. So I'm pretty excited about thinking through these subjects and seeing where they head.
You guys are eventually going to get me to read Virilio, aren't you? Artem, you're next.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm Artem. I'm originally from Russia. I'm currently in the U.S. at Boston, sophomore, doing a BA in mathematics and philosophy. Currently all over the place. Have a bunch of interest in a lot of contemporary theory, but have no background to actually be a good scholar. So I'm trying to catch up mostly. This is my first official encounter. I wrote an essay on Deleuze somewhere back last year, and that was the first time when I've actually read Deleuze and Nietzsche, but this is my first official acquaintance with him as an independent author, so I'm very much looking forward to it.
When did you come to the States?
Oh, well, this is my sophomore year, so last year was the first year in the States.
So you had been in Russia up to that point?
Yeah.
You have no accent whatsoever.
Oh, yeah, that's the fun part. Everybody just kind of started throwing US pop material at me, so at some point you just start talking their language.
Wow, that's amazing. It's a translation of my second book is coming out in Russian here probably this month.
Oh, who's the one translating it?
I forget. That's terrible, isn't it?
It's possibly by Heil Press.
That sounds right.
Yeah, I know. I know those people. They would be the ones to do it. So sorry.
Yeah, I think they did Graham's quadruple object before. It's that same press. So.
Oh, those. Okay, that's not that, but I understand who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, and they keep trying to get me out to the Perth region, but I can't find a time to make it work because it's quite a flight
Yeah.
every year. But I hope to make it there eventually. John Michael.
Yes, it's me. I am an attorney. I picked up, sort of the BA, was in philosophy. Some number of years ago, the law is fairly boring. Picked up a master's, in my downtime in philosophy, and that seemed like a fun thing, very, very, exhilarating. So here I am, basically.
Welcome. This is the second class of mine you've been in, and so I'm glad to have you here once again. All right, so next week we will be doing the, and we can talk more about Leibniz if you want to, or if more further questions come up. But this is just kind of to give us the background necessary for understanding these concepts. So next week we'll be doing the first couple of chapters of Muriel Kuhn's book on Simondon, which is going to be all about individuation, or what makes things what they are. And Jacob will be the victim, leading us with questions through that material. But really, really fascinating stuff, the Simondon. So I look forward to seeing all of you next week. Maria, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? Part of the class as well, so.
I was trying to avoid it. Yeah, sure. I work at the News Center. I've started out as a student here, and I've kind of just stuck around. Don't really want to leave. I really like it. I enjoyed the Deleuze class led by Levi last spring, and I just want to keep going. Leibniz and the cross between Leibniz and Deleuze, and his Fold book was actually my first, the first time I read a book by Deleuze multiple times and actually enjoyed and was the most perplexed by of all of them. And I'm really excited about delving deeper into that and actually understanding Leibniz this time, because I had no basis in any of that stuff beforehand.
Well, Artem is going to be in charge of the mathematics. So you'll lead us through all the calculus and explain these things to us.
Let's try.
You can lead us through the Leibniz in the Fold, since this is your book.
Yeah, cool.
I kid.
That'd be fun. Yeah.
Really. All right, so I'll see all of you next week. Good discussion. Thank you.
Can I jump in with just one thing?
Yes.
Again, we're working a little bit busy. If there's any sense of what are we reading in the Foucault book, just because I have a little extra time right now, so just to get ahead.
Yeah, we'll be doing about 45 pages a week for 3 weeks in the Foucault book. I think it's 138 pages. And I haven't broken it down into chapters or anything like that, but that's going to be what it takes to get through it in 3 weeks.
That sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah. So, all right, I'll see you all next week.
Oh,
Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, what are we reading from the Simondon book?
It is pages 1 to 55, and so the link is actually only a selection from the Simondon.
Okay.
It's 55 pages.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Okay.
Next week.
Okay.